Welcome to Kingdomize, the podcast, where we discuss how to see our lives and our world through a kingdom lens, how to infuse kingdom culture into our families, our workplaces, and our cities, as we all participate in the dream of Jesus to see his kingdom on earth as it is in heaven. Welcome back to Kingdomize, the podcast. Kingdomize Global, as you know, is a global ministry. We're all over the world, business, ministry. My friend Chuck Proudfit would call it a businessry. We don't know. You can call it whatever you want. But we're here to talk about kingdom leadership. And I'm here with Bruce Mann, the man that knows everything about kingdom leadership. And Bruce, every time I say that, you have that same reaction. That I wish you would. I wish
pretty
you would.
ominous.
But we're here today with Bruce Mann to discuss one of my favorite topics, and this is going to be fantastic. Like if you're driving, you may want to just pull aside, like you just need to take this in. We're going to talk today about becoming a cultural architect. So this will be fantastic. So Bruce, I'm going to let you set this up. What does that mean? Where are we going today? Like, help us understand what we need to understand today on the way through.
Yeah, this was a way of understanding how our leadership impacts the environment that we operate in, whether it's your family, a church, an organization, a business. There's an ethos to what you do. And as a leader, we want to help people understand how do they lead in such a way. I love the term life-giving culture, an environment that exudes energy and life and is vibrant and leads people towards something positive, doesn't drain them, doesn't sap them. So there's a lot of conversation out there about culture. We want to help to find that today. When we talk about culture, what do we mean? We want to dive deeper into what it means to be a cultural architect. I think you can gain from that, that expression, the idea of building culture, designing culture. In God's kingdom, our hearts are redeemed. Our lives are redeemed, but our minds are transformed. And so the kind of culture that we create within the various areas that we operate in, again, family, business, church, whatever it happens to be, it's got to be transformative. It's not something that happens overnight. And so we need to understand that our redemption is given to us freely as a gift, by God. Our transformation is a process. And as leaders, we are part of providing that transformative experience and environment. We want to talk a little bit about the culture gap. We'll explain a bit more about what that means. And then end by talking about how do we create a life-giving culture. So I'm hopeful today what I'm sharing is really structured enough that people can kind of move along with some of the ideas and really begin to kind of get a good understanding, a good picture of what it means to be a cultural architect.
Well, I can guarantee you that you will do that because I've heard you share this several times, and every time I pick up something fantastic. So I have no doubt that that's going to happen today. So my understanding, let's start broader then. Let's start with, and before we go to the cultural architect or the gap, let's actually start with, let's define culture. How would you define culture?
Well, it's not that stuff that's growing on, your stuff in your fridge.
So I can get rid of that.
Definitely. You can get rid of that.
Okay, all right.
We're not talking about, culture in the sense, well, I'm cultured, you're not. We're sort of this high-minded idea that, there's sort of this elite sense of living and functioning. We're talking about kind of the environment, the ethos, the spirit of what we're leading, what we're involved in. The dictionary defines culture simply as relating to the habits, traditions, and beliefs of a society. It's the accepted norm I'm going to touch on this idea of social facts in a moment, but it's the accepted norm or social facts of a group of people in a given time. That's the dictionary definition. I'm going to offer this definition, and hopefully it's a little more to the point for us. And for our purposes, I'd like to define culture as the filter or the perceptual filter that determines our actions, our responses, and our outlook within a given defined community. I make that point because most people here, if they are married and have children, their family has a certain culture about it. There's a filter that thoughts and actions and responses are passed through. Your business, as we've already said, if you're part of a church, if you're part of any other organization. And so it's the perceptual filter that determines your actions, responses, and outlook within a given defined community.
So for the sake of this, and that's really, really good. For the sake of that, I understand what a filter is, but I'm just a simple guy, right? What's a perceptual filter for the sake of this?
It would be the understanding of why things happen and why I respond in a certain way. If you grew up in what we might call a landmine home, a landmine family, where your parents were prone to outbursts of anger or kind of almost irrational responses. So you're almost like you're walking on a field full of landmines. Well, that creates for you a certain perceptual filter of the world. It creates this idea, I got to be cautious. I got to watch what I say. I got to always be on guard about reaction. So everything about our upbringing, where we've grown up, where we've, what we've participated in has created for us a filter that we pass our thoughts through that tells us what to do in any given setting. And certain, we can talk about, the birth order and how different kids in different birth orders respond to circumstances. But it's really that filter that's created by the sum total of all the influences of our life that we pass our thoughts through that creates our responses and our actions and our outlook on life.
This is making this tricky now. It's already tricky because everyone that comes into your group now has different perceptual historical filters. They're bringing all their backpacks with them. Their baggage is all coming. So without going to that yet, because I think we'll deal with that in a few minutes. So we've defined culture. That's really good. Let's now define what is a cultural architect. So that's where we're headed today. We want to help make cultural architects. What is that?
Right. So I'll define it in the general sense, and then I'll define it in the context of a Christian worldview from a leader's perspective. So in the general sense, a cultural architect is someone who intentionally works to create an environment that reflects and promotes a certain understanding of life. In the same way that a building architect creates a building for certain purposes, it's built and designed to create certain functions, to accommodate certain functions. It's built and designed to look a certain way, to give a certain impression, to have an impact on the people who use the building. A cultural architect is someone who does the very same thing, intentionally creates an environment that has an impact on people to create a certain outcome.
Yeah, so that's, as you said, that has to do with our life, our relationship of values, how we experience the world or others experience the world around us, right?
Yeah, for sure.
Okay.
And so the thing about that is that you have to be intentional, right? Life isn't just a big box you live out, and if we want certain outcomes in life, we have to be intentional about how we approach life. Right. And as a leader, since that's our focus is leadership, I have the capacity as a leader to design a culture that has a certain outcome, a certain project. So here's where we get it, and this is too big a topic to kind of go too deeply into today, but a leader has a certain degree of authority to create the culture for their organization, for their, whether they're leading their family or whatever the context is. You always get, unfortunately, people who will take illegitimate authority and impress on your context their worldview, their expectations, their expectations, right? And so really there's an issue here of legitimate and illegitimate authorities. I'll touch on that in a moment when we talk about the 4 laws of culture. But as a leader, I have the responsibility and the privilege of creating a life-giving culture. If I take that to the next step of thinking, okay, how do I do this as a Christian, someone who's a follower of Jesus, who wants the environment that I have giving leadership to reflect the attributes of God's kingdom and reflect the qualities, values, and virtues that we see, that we desire to see functioning in God's kingdom within the context we lead in. Jesus is our greatest example of someone who was incredibly intentional about how he led that small group of people, how he impacted them, how he taught them, how he defined reality for them. And so it's a fabulous study to look at Jesus not as the savior of the world, powerful, obviously we understand him to be that, but to study the Gospels and see Jesus as a cultural architect who laid the foundation for the kingdom of God. Paul described himself as a master builder. Jesus was the master builder, the cultural architect that created the foundation for God's kingdom. Big study. We could take a long, long time, but I think hopefully people are getting the idea of being, as a leader, being intentional about the environment that you create.
Yeah, really good. And no matter where you want to do that, and obviously this is a leadership context, kingdom leadership context, and you've talked about family, but no matter what it is, it has to be very intentional, where you create it and then you protect it, and then new people come and go, and you have to do it all over again. So that's really important. And which goes back to what you were just saying, I believe, about that integrity of if you're coming and going and there's an established culture, you probably should mellow out a bit, and you probably don't get to change that. You've now come into a culture, and you should probably adopt that culture.
Yeah.
Am I saying that correctly?
Yeah, and I mean, you and I have a kind of different experience. Both of us led, pastored churches at the same time, 2 blocks away from each other.
Yeah.
Back a few years ago. You planted the church. You had the ability to create the culture of the congregation from day one.
Right.
And that's one pathway to developing a life-giving culture. I inherited a congregation, and with 160-year history, that had some challenges. And so I had to reshape, recast over time a new understanding, a new expression of a vibrant faith that was giving life to people, not just upholding traditions. Nothing wrong with traditions if they're life-giving and if they're helping. If they're not, we have to creatively destroy them and introduce new ideas and thoughts. So all that to say, the culture, as leaders, it's our responsibility to create the culture that brings life to people, not just to give orders, not just to set strategy.
Yeah.
And this is what I see so powerfully in Jesus. He spent an incredible amount of time creating an environment, a culture that equipped his followers to go out and change the world.
Yeah.
And often was a great deal of frustration on his part to their ability to understand and accept it.
I was excited about Jesus' comment every once in a while. I go, "Oh, guys, how long will I strive with you?" So, but he created a culture. It was life giving. It was kingdom, and even
Yeah,
it gives me hope because every once in a while Jesus went, "How long will I strive with you?"
yeah.
So
The, the,
while we're there, you mentioned something in the introduction, Bruce, about cultural gap or what
yeah.
how does that fit in here?
Well, the cultural gap is the space between your declared culture and your actual culture.
Right.
Most organizations have beautiful sounding value statements, vision, mission, and they put them on the wall. They look great, they're inspiring. But sometimes you get into the actual day to day life of that organization or that family or that church, whatever the setting is, and you realize we're not quite living up to that.
Yeah. Yeah.
That is not actually the case. And so there's this gap between the declared culture, the values and vision for that culture, and the day to day actual living it out. And
Yeah.
the distance, the size of that gap is the degree of credibility that you have as a leader and that the culture of your organization has in terms of impacting people. The closer our declared culture and our actual culture get together, the narrower the gap, the higher level of credibility that you have as a leader and as an organization.
Yeah.
I could
Yeah.
give stories about how that plays out. I'm sure people are thinking already, oh yeah, I can see that. You can see, the where sometimes there's these great ideas, great policies, but they're not adhered to.
Yes.
Workarounds, fudging things, less than integrous actions, that type of thing. And so before we can really begin to understand the impact of culture, we actually have to do the analysis and say, what's the gap between what I say we are and what we really are?
Yeah.
Hopefully they're close.
Yeah. That's amazing, and that is an hour-long discussion, and that comes with self awareness, and it leads to what I was saying earlier about that you both are a cultural architect, but then part of that is a protector, right? That you create the
Mm,
culture, but then you have to protect it that gap. So not protecting the
yeah,
gap, protecting the culture. So well, let's
yeah.
really good. And again, we could talk about that for a long time, but we really can't today. We will, but
We'll
so
get
you
there.
said you have 4 laws of how to create culture. So I would love to hear these because
Okay.
I'm now taking notes. Go.
Okay. So these are the 4 laws of culture creating, and they're not good or bad. They're just true. Um, Anyone can create a culture, and they can use these laws to create a bad one
Right.
because
Right.
that's the nature of it, right? So let me go through them, and I'll try to summarize them quickly. The first one is if you don't have a culture by design, you will have a culture by default, right? Should make
Okay.
sense to people, right? If you're not intentional about how you function in your home, you're just going to bounce off the wall. Whatever happens, it's very reactionary. It's just get through the day, just deal with the crisis, move on to the next one. So if you don't have a culture by design, you're going to have one by default. And by definition, default cultures are low functioning and low impact in terms of bringing about good results in people's lives. We could go along deeply into that, but hopefully that's sort of
No, that's
people
great.
can
That's
kind of
great.
gain that. The second one here is a little more challenging. It's whoever creates the culture rules the house. Whoever creates the culture rules the house. I'll use a quick example where we'll use a family unit as an example where parents kind of um, don't take their responsibility as being leaders, both spiritually and in other ways in their home, and they allow the children to really create the culture in the house. They're not being intentional about how they function as a family, and so other people, these illegitimate authorities, I don't know if you've ever children called illegitimate authorities, but
No, but I love the ring of that.
that if people who are not given the responsibility to lead don't lead, someone else is going to step in and determine the rules. I worked in an environment once in a large nonprofit. I may have even shared this in one of our other episodes, where there was an individual who was very almost a bully in the office environment on an executive team, and was creating a culture that caused everyone to have to work around them, and where you'd have to have a meeting to determine how you were going to respond in a meeting, right, to this person who was just a bully.
Right.
And so that was an illegitimate authority who was creating an environment, creating a culture, and they ruled the house because the legitimate authority wasn't fulfilling their obligation to address that issue. So whoever creates the culture rules the house. When the legitimate authorities are doing their job, are fulfilling their obligation as a leader, then you have the ability, to have an intentional culture that they're thoughtfully creating. They can do a good or bad job of it, but they're the legitimate authorities. So whoever creates a culture rules the house. You see this all the time. So the third law is something that will probably sound familiar, but what a culture grows. Right? We all know the biblical principle of you reap what you sow, right?
Right.
You sow corn in a field, you don't get potatoes, you get corn. So in the cultural setting, what a culture grows. So if your culture is ruled by fear, by legalism, by greed, by whatever, it's going to grow those qualities, positive or negative, because seeds duplicate after their kind. You sow seeds in your culture of trust, of affirmation, of training, of all those good qualities. It's going to grow people who grow to assume that that's the way our culture works. So what a culture is, a culture grows. And so it's incumbent on us to make sure that what we're sowing, what we're developing, is actually, being aware that we're going to duplicate that in others. So, So the last law of culture is you have to work within the culture to change the culture. And by that I mean you can't develop a life-giving culture with policies and procedures only. Just telling people to be kind to each other is not any assurance that they're going to be kind to each other. Right? You have to demonstrate. You have to be part of it. We're going to talk about this in a moment, how we do this. But you can't create culture remotely. You have to actually participate in the process, because it needs leadership, it needs demonstration, it needs guidance. And again, we can look at powerful lessons of how Jesus dealt with challenges, conflicts, relational conflicts, wrong understandings. He couldn't do it just by writing a letter and saying do this, do that. He actually he participated in the life of his community to show them how. And that, I don't see, to me, that's a given. But sometimes we want to define culture simply by statements and pretty pictures on the wall. And you got to participate. You got to be part of it.
Yeah.
So,
Bruce, I don't know if you remember the website. We used to joke about it quite often, about the demotivators. And so those pictures on the side of the wall, the little motivation pictures. It's like, and one of the demotivators said, if a pretty picture and a neat slogan can change your life, you probably got a very simple job that robots will be doing soon.
Yeah. Yeah.
So that idea that you can't, it's not about a slogan. And I'm a fan of strategic slogans, but this action and participation you're talking about is so vital, so good.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah, excellent. So we're coming down to the wire here. We're already at application mode. This is
Okay.
amazing. So we've got a few here that are awesome, and I'm just going to stay out of the way and volley back to you about. So what does this look? What's the application for us as we're listening today?
So let me go through. I'll go through this pretty quickly, and it's pretty high level. You have to, obviously, people will need to think about how does this play out in my situation, my context. But let me touch on 5 things that will help get kind of a grasp on how we create a life-giving culture. First of all, the first one is everything matters. Everything matters. Everything is spiritual in that sense. Every action sends a message. Declared support is not felt support. So by that I mean just telling someone you care about them does not mean they feel cared for.
Right.
Felt support comes from actually doing something, actually being there, actually participating. And so everything matters. There's no throwaway parts in relationships. Every action sends a message. And so we need to just be aware of that it's comprehensive in that regard.
Yeah, it gets us back to your statement that you've repeated a number of times here about intentionality. Like, think before you act. Think about you do it. How does it fit the values of the company?
Yeah.
Everything matters. Yeah. Really good. What's next?
First of all, then we have to, by demonstrating values that are aligned with God's character and kingdom. Acceptance, challenge, loving people, caring for the need, like affirming them, being a participant in their growth and their development, being champions for who they are. By demonstrating the values that we espouse, that are aligned with God's character and his kingdom, we create an environment where people can prosper. I love the term that this is like oxygen for the soul and the spirit. Right? It's people will be starved for oxygen, spiritual oxygen, when we withhold from them the things that they are, were created to desire and to have and participate in. Yeah. Which doesn't mean everything is okay. It means we address issues the way that God would address them. There's a reason why Jesus was full of grace and then truth, not truth then grace.
Yeah.
It was, that there is a first step to correction, and that is helping people grow. So demonstrating values, not just declaring them, but actually living them out. The next one is seeing things from the eternal perspective. Some hills are worth dying on, some are not, right? As a leader. If every hill is, you're dying on every hill, you're going to exasperate people. And again, we can look at Jesus, who didn't die on every hill. He actually only died on one hill. He managed, as a leader, all of the other aspects of his disciples' growth. And we could show great examples of how he did that so skillfully. But we need to keep the eternal perspective. Meaning there are some things that are important and other things that aren't as important. And we need to hold those in balance and not die on every hill.
Really good. Really good.
That may sound like compromise. I think it's just wisdom.
100%. Yeah, I'm with you on that. Yeah.
So then the fourth one is we need to help develop language and stories that help define and design what we're all about, what the culture is all about, so that people have ways of expressing the values. This is where the pretty pictures on the wall come in, right? They're important. I'm not suggesting we shouldn't do it. In fact, what I'm suggesting is actually we do need to define and design ways of expressing the values and the purpose of whatever organization, whatever context we're in, family, church, whatever, ways that help people grasp the principles, the truths, and be able to kind of engage in those. That takes work. Jesus, again, is our best example. we could probably all quote 10 things Jesus said that were value-based, that were how he interpreted kingdom. The first will be last. The greatest among you will be the servant. Whoever, like all of these ways that he expressed kingdom, the mustard seed of faith, ways that he defined and designed the ability to communicate the kingdom that we still use today.
100%. I think Jesus' one-liners were fantastic, and I don't know that you could find a better storyteller, right? So I think it fits exactly what you're saying here about culture, for sure.
Yeah. And then the last piece here is seeing change as a normal outcome of those things that will never change. I love this expression, evaluation is the breakfast of champions. That we see change as a normal outcome of things that will never change. And that, for me, that gives the license, the ability to evaluate and say, this doesn't work anymore. Let's stop doing it. The purpose doesn't change. The goals don't change. The values, but the expressions might. Organizations, even families, can get so locked into traditions they become oppressive. Who's our greatest example of that in Scripture is our friends the Pharisees, the Sadducees, who were so locked into an expression of reality that they couldn't accept the kingdom of God, or very few of them could. And so when we know what will never change, it allows us then to be free to change things that need to change.
Yeah. Which loops back to your eternal perspective discussion too, right? Like, I think they're linked. And so this is fantastic. And my recommendation to people that are listening right now is that you may want to go back and listen to this again, and again, take notes. Don't tell anybody, Bruce, but we were talking about this. I grabbed 4 of your points and put them in another document that I'm going to use later. So while you're chatting. So we're out of time today, but how do you wrap this up? So we're talking about cultural architects. I'm listening to you going, yeah, I need to use that. That's really good. I could talk about that there. As we're listening, what do you want to see? What needs to happen next?
Well, my hope is that, each one of these sessions we're going through builds on the next, or, that we build the next on top. And so we've talked up till now about vision, about voice, about values, about the power of humility, about the relational restorative nature of God's kingdom. As leaders, this is where we need to begin to internalize that and start saying, okay, how am I leading? What's the impact of my leadership? What are the messages my leadership is giving? And am I actually building something? Am I designing, as a skillful architect, an environment, a culture that is bringing life to people, challenging them, but that in and of itself brings life. It allows them to grow. And I would say to people, Jesus is always our best example of someone who did this so powerfully, and we're still living out the impact of the 3 years he spent with a group of 12 guys, 2,000 years ago. So being intentional, understanding their role in designing a culture, not just having a default culture that's being pushed around by the values of the world, but one that is actually setting a standard that is aligned with God's plan and purpose for them and for their organization or whatever context they're leading in.
I've loved this expression since the first time I heard you use it, the idea of being cultural architect. It's so kingdom. It takes us from the gospel of salvation to the gospel of the kingdom, which takes us back to Genesis 1 of God created and then gave us that image to be able to be creative as well. And so important. So Bruce, thank you again for leading us through this dialogue this week. And I want to thank you as well for listening this week. You probably have some great ideas as it has to do with values and vision and being cultural architects. We'd love to hear that as well. And if we can come alongside you and help you get where you want to go with what you're building, we're always here for that as well. So thanks for tuning in again this week to Kingdomize, the podcast. We'll see you next week. Thanks for joining us today on Kingdomize, the podcast. Let's keep the discussion going throughout the week on our socials or on our website, kingdomizeglobal.com. Contact us today to see how we can walk together to see more of God's kingdom in your city as it is in heaven.